Hi, everyone, from U.S. History 1. Today is September 21st. I'm going to try to put up a little review of my kind of perspective on Chapter 3. I'm also going to start putting up some other, perhaps, if not articles, certainly YouTube links of instructors or presentations or PBS or history channel links that I think are exceptional. Some of you Now, this theory has been debunked that we have different learning styles, audio, or do we learn better in reading, or do we learn better tactically? I still think there's some truth to the fact that we might learn differently and better in different contexts, or maybe even overlapping contexts. So it doesn't hurt to throw those things up there. And we're not coming to class every day in a traditional sense, so we do have the time. And occasionally, some of these videos that I come across are pretty entertaining and are pretty good. So I'm going to try to put a few up there in a section called, I just think, video links or something like that. It's not my little reviews that I'm going to do. Chapter 3 in the textbook is talking about British North America. The British are eventually going to dominate the entire continent, but for a period of time, there's really three major European entities. There are more. Obviously, the Dutch are involved, the Portuguese are involved, the Swedes are involved. There's even some German immigration. But the main one we're talking about is what we call New France, which is up in Canada, going down the Ohio River Valley in Louisiana. I always think of it as two major areas of French. I don't really think of it as colonization the same way it is for Great Britain, but a French imprint, if you will, on the North American continent. And that's mostly up in the Canadian region and then down in Louisiana. They had those two regions. And the Spanish are well into South America, Central America, and all the way over to the southwest of what we consider today modern United States, even all the way up to the West Coast in Florida too. But they're thin and they're stretched, and their colonization, if you will, is different than it is with the British. The British are bringing over families. They're bringing over these sort of permanent expectations to live and to thrive as a community differently than the French. The French were coming over to trade and to get economic gain. And although they were going to settle as well, not the same way that the British were in terms of bringing over and building churches and communities that were symbolic of what they thought of as back home. The Spanish and the French were more about economic gain than the British were about colonization. And it's all about competition, too, in this era. We know Spain's first, the French are thereafter, and then the British are a little late to the game, but they came in with a different sort of mentality that they're going to ship over families. We know the first two big ones, Jamestown in Virginia, and then Massachusetts Bay Colony. Those are the first to develop. We know Jamestown was a complete failure, in part because of geography, but also in part because they brought over almost only things related to harvesting or seeking out gold and other precious metals, and not to farm and not to really create stable communities at all. In fact, the rate of perishment of, it's a terrible term, but the survival rate was very, very low for the initial Jamestown settlement. Virginia only really takes off as a successful settlement in that region after they move inland and they start growing tobacco, because it becomes a huge wealth generator for the Virginia colony. Massachusetts, the Bay Colony, is much more successful. It's more of a middling class, and they have an expectations, families coming over, and they're more organized in their attempts to create a community outside of Boston, Plymouth. We all know that famous story. So the book starts off, the chapter in Chapter 3 starts off with slavery and the horrors of slavery, but it does talk also about the evolution of slavery. Slavery took on many different sort of forms, all of it evil and disgusting. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. And every so often I do come across someone who tries to argue some kind of benevolence in the way slaves were treated, but it's still slavery. It's still horrific, no matter how you examine it. But early on, slavery was a bit different. It was more of an indentured servitude. Slaves had a potential expectation to be freed at some point after an indebted period of time of work for an owner, as outrageous as that sounds. But it really took a different change when the African slave trade really picked up. It became an essential part of the economy, especially in the southern region of what we consider today the United States. It never really took off in large-scale form in the Northeast, largely because of the nature of industry versus purely agriculture. Intensive labor was needed in the southern regions, and the slave trade really, really took off with the Dutch and the English, and it was sort of this triangle where they would come down from Europe, they would go to the west coast of Africa, they would enslave a significant number of people, and they would be brought over, usually to the Caribbean first. The sugar industry and out of the what we call the West Indies was huge. That was a big moneymaker for a long time. The colonies along the eastern seaboard weren't the big moneymakers initially. It was the West Indies that were the moneymakers, and it was called a seasoning process. Sometimes the slaves were initially brought to those areas for a period of time before they were eventually brought into, usually the port of Charleston was a big one in South Carolina, to begin their horrific life as a slave. And it really changed during this era. There was no longer this conception of a period of servitude. It became a racial element as well. Once you were a slave now, you were always going to be enslaved. In fact, laws were passed in Virginia and South Carolina and other colonies that any woman that was a slave who gave birth to a child would also be in a form of slavery for life. This is regardless of whether or not the father of that child was a free person, a white person. It didn't matter. And so what was different about the indentured servitude of other Europeans that came over, I'm going to come over, I'll work for you for 7 years for passage so I can have a chance for my family, whether it was religious persecution or just economic hardship. There was that sense of hope, and if you didn't like it, if you felt a sense of barbarity to the whole indentured servitude, if you escaped, you could blend into the community. You weren't condemned simply by the color of your skin or ethnicity. Where African slaves, they could never leave the bondage of the identity that really developed in a really psychosocial outlook among the British people, that those people of color would always be in a form of servitude. And it's tragic, and the book does a very nice job of documenting the significant numbers of people that were taken from the African continent, brought to either the West Indies or ultimately to what we consider the United States, to serve out their lives and the lives of several other generations in the form of slavery. And the book does also a nice job, too, of talking about the precursor to the large African-American, well, they weren't called Americans at the time, but the African enslavement, were the enslavement of Native American people through war and conflict. And the Native Americans were doing it themselves. Part of their history in warring with other tribes would be the successor would often enslave the losers for a period of time, or until assimilation occurred. And that's different. See, there's a sense that the slaves in the Native American communities, as well as indentured servitude individuals that came over from the European continent, they would eventually become liberated or become assimilated within the community. That's not true of African American slaves, and that's even more tragic to the story. Not that the story isn't tragic enough being enslaved in any way, shape, or form, but often there's something between. It says 24,000 and 51,000 Native Americans were forced into slavery throughout the southern colonies between 1670 and 1715. A lot of people escape that part of history, knowing that Native Americans, significant amounts of them, were put into a form of slavery with the aid of other Native American groups sometimes, because that's the cost of conflict and war. But it wasn't often a permanent station life, because why? They died. They died in significant numbers from disease. They needed, and that's the push. And why African American slaves? Why? Because the Native American slave numbers weren't bountiful enough to cover the new need for physical labor in the new colonies, but also Native American enslavement wasn't successful. They would perish, and they would not reproduce in this sort of captive condition. They would often die or be killed, and the death wasn't always because of murder. Death was because of disease. Over 90% of Native Americans, it appears from the records and the history, died from just exposure to European diseases. So the African American slave trade, which especially what was unique in North America, and I thought the book would do a little better job. It does mention it, but it mentions in passing, is one of the few areas where enslaved people actually propagated within themselves. So slaves would have children, and those children were born into slavery. That African American slavery did not have a self-perpetuating birth rate, if you will, in South America or in any other part of the world. It was only in North America that it became self-perpetuating. When we get into later about the Constitutional Convention, when we create the Constitution, one of the things was there was this obviously this tension about ending the slave trade, bringing over more people from Africa in the form of enslavement, and they put in the Constitution that wouldn't be able to be banned until 1808. Now people say, well, that's really, I don't know, it's not nice, it's awful in a way. In every way it's awful, but at least there's an acknowledgement that this is going to come to an end in terms of the slave trade. But why were those states that were so dependent on slavery and so much wanted to preserve the institution of slavery willing to allow the potential abolishment in the future? It wasn't the abolishment of slavery they were willing to agree to after 1808. It was the ending of the slave trade from the continent of Africa, because there were so many slaves already in the colonies that they were self-perpetuating. We didn't need to bring in more new ones from outside the continent. I just find that a very fascinating, dark period of history, but it's got to be talked about. Some of the things that were going on in society right now are the ripples. There's no question they tie into the history of slavery and racism that was the birth of this nation. And I like to think of our country as coming a very long way in correcting great wrongs, but we still have to examine the great wrongs. And one of the big ones is obviously slavery. And not that it didn't exist in the Northeast. A lot of us from Massachusetts take pride in the sense that Pennsylvania technically made a law ending slavery for those after a period of servitude could become free after a certain period of time. But the technical end date, the first end date of any colony that ended slavery in terms of today it ends, is Massachusetts through legislation. So some of these people take pride in that, but that doesn't mean we didn't have slavery in Massachusetts for a period of time. We did. In fact, it was fairly significant in even New York State for a period of time. But over time, economics plays the key factor in whether or not slavery would become prominent or almost dissolve on its own accord. And that's exactly what happened basically in the northeastern area of the country. Slavery becomes economically unviable and there's no real attraction to it. And a lot of people think it's because we're more thoughtful in the Northeast and we recognize the great wrong. Part of that's true with some people, and there's some people down south that even wanted to end slavery from the very inception, but not all. And I question whether or not we can feel good about being in the Northeast, recognizing that's where the abolitionist movement really took hold. But it took hold, I'm not saying because, but it really is reflective of the economic drive that the South was fearful of losing whatever economic wealth they have when slavery ended because of the plantation system. But anyways, I'm a little bit off track. We'll talk about that a great deal more, obviously, when we get to near the end of the semester in this book and in this course about the Civil War and all those tensions over either the contraction of slavery, the ending of slavery, or the expansion of slavery in the new territories west of the Mississippi as the country grows. So the slave trade, they talk about the horrors, and here's, I think the book does a nice job talking about the recent estimates count between 11 and 12 million Africans were forced across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th century. Again, we know in terms of legality, it ended in 1808, but there was still a lot of smuggling going on, very little enforcement. But generally speaking, between those years, that's an incredible number of people considering the population as a whole in the American colonies. It needs to be revisited, needs to be talked about, needs to be exposed, and so we don't ever repeat such, evil and tragic parts of history. But we have to acknowledge it. How else do you move on and become what we hope to be aspirational in terms of equality and fairness and equity without examining that really sad part of our American history? I have a friend of mine that went to the Gulf of New Guinea, and there's a piece of artwork on page 59. I don't know if you have pages when you look in electronic form. I actually ordered the physical book. I'm kind of an old person. I like to physically look through the book. I tried to select this book one because I thought it was good, but you get electronic free form. You can order it physically if you like it. But I have a friend of mine that served in the Peace Corps there, and she told me about how there's actually something called the Remembrance Tree where African enslaved individuals would walk around literally to just, I guess it was, she described it as a process where the history suggested that it was to forget everything that you knew there, to start anew. as a form of slave in the New World, and you leave there. And so many of them perished on the way over. The horror shows in the book and the horror stories of doctors and captains on boats and things that witnessed the death, the inhumanity to people, to themselves too, because it's not only inhumane for the enslaved, but there's an inhumanity in being the depriver of basic human dignity to others. And it's going to be a tragedy we're still dealing with to this day, not in terms of direct slavery, but in terms of some of the scar tissue that we have as a nation. But the modern idea of race as a way of classification and subjugating other people really began during this period of time, because it just made it easier to. Native Americans would do the same things. They would talk about other tribes being really of a different race, of a different identity. They're foreign to our species, and we have a superiority, and therefore we have the right, if you will, a God-given right to subjugate other people. But it was easier by the physical identification of being able to do it. You're British or you're European versus you're of African descent, and it really creates a long-term tragedy that exists to this day, I'd argue. So now we had this enslaved men, enslaved women. It's going to go on to perpetuality. There's no longer hope, like as there was in previous generations, for people that came over in a type of indentured servitude to get liberty. And even enslaved Native Americans would also have those hopes of assimilation, later release. But that wasn't true of African Americans. This is going to be a form of permanency. And we know there's going to be a lot of turmoil later on. We'll talk about that later, where some African Americans, they become Americans, are freed in some communities, but they're not allowed to stay in the South because Southern leaders don't want to have freed African Americans or Africans. They won't call them Americans till much later, because it would give enslaved people incentive to riot until they want a piece of dignity and freedom themselves. So turmoil in Britain, I'm going a bit long on this because we have to talk about it a lot, but we'll talk about it in later chapters. But turmoil in Britain, we know a lot of the Protestant Reformation is going to create not only political repercussions in Europe, but also religious ones. And we know there's an irony here, because the Great Britain is Protestant. It becomes an official church, the Anglican Church. Basically, the king says, I'm going to be the head of it, but it's Protestant in terms of its dogma. But ironically, there's some Protestants there that are so dogmatic about the faith and how the faith has to be delivered and be part of your life in a daily fashion. The more liberal Anglican Church, when I mean liberal in the sense of there's almost going to be a secularness to the way in which government runs. The Puritans wanted it to be immersed into every moment of your aspect, and they're saying the Anglican Church is unpure, and that's where the nickname, it was a derogatory term over in Great Britain, they would call them Puritans, and they're just too absolutist, and so they were persecuted there. And the book doesn't talk about this, but I always found it fascinating. Many of them left for the Netherlands and for a period of time to be with the Dutch, because the Dutch were, hey, everyone can kind of come in here, you can coexist here, but the Puritans didn't like being there because their society was so liberal and so, to them, scandalous, that they need to find another place to go to. And where is it? It's the New World. And so there's almost I call it the second wave of immigration to the colonies. The first was about economic exploitation and economic new beginnings. The second sort of tier of motivation to come over is religious freedom. And this is, I have to put this on the test. It's really fascinating me. It's religious freedom for you, meaning the Puritans or some other group that wants to come over, but it's going to be religious persecution from anybody else that's within your community. There was an intolerance to others. In fact, the Puritans actually executed some Quakers in Massachusetts because they refused to either flee, they gave them the opportunity to leave, or convert to the faith, or be obliging to the faith, and they refused to do so, and they were executed. So these different things, the turmoil that's breaking out in Britain, we know Queen Elizabeth ultimately does establish the Protestant faith as it's unquestionable, because there's a lot of time in England that are we going back to Catholicism? Are we going to go back to the fold, if you will? Because there's different leaders in the monarchy that have sympathies towards the Catholic faith, and they might want to go back into that that view, and there's always suspicion over that, and that's what some of the Civil War in Great Britain is going to be over about, is the view of whether or not someone's a loyalist to the Catholic faith as opposed to the Anglican Church and Protestantism. We go through there. We ultimately know that there's a lot of tension going back and forth. Ultimately, there's the Civil War. The Parliament wins. Charles is executed. Charles won, and we know when he's executed, Oliver Cromwell takes over, and the Parliament becomes supreme. And some of the important things that come out during that period of time is an expectation that there are certain civil rights, if you will, for British citizens, and the colonists believe they have them as well. And some people say that's a precursor to some of our values when we do have a revolution, is the protection of some of these civil liberties that were developed in Great Britain during the time of the civil unrest back in Mother England. So the English government, and what I think is most important really right up until 1763, is that for the most part, do they try at times, are there a little bit waves of trying to get more control over the colonies? Yeah, but they're never really out of control. They're just somewhat ignored. We have this thing called mercantilism, which I'm going to have to test you on quite a bit. Mercantilism in the sense that the colonies are there to benefit Mother England. The colonies get benefit out of it too, but the primary sort of who gets the upper hand is always got to be England. They're going to garner more wealth, more assets, more trade, more industry, more physical property as a result of the concept of mercantilism. It's all designed to serve Mother England. The colonies benefit from it as well too, but for the most part, because the colonies are serving well, there's an economic boon as a result of the colonies' development. There's a doctrine called splendid neglect. Basically, we're going to let the colonies kind of run themselves on some level. And there's an argument that's the underpinnings of our revolution was we were allowed to have colonial assemblies, legislatures, and we're allowed to kind of do a lot of home rule as long as we weren't bucking the trend. And really, there wasn't that much of a bucking a trend. There was no direct taxation at all because at the time, Great Britain didn't need it. And they kind of let the salutary neglect occur and let the colonies kind of run their own gambit for a period of time. Oliver Cromwell does try to cramp down for a bit of time. The Navigation Act, there's some other rules and regulations that come down. There's more attempts to really control the colonial governments, but they don't last that long. In fact, there's ultimately the crown comes back. Charles II comes back. He's a bit of a Catholic sympathizer, but he's Protestant. But he comes back into power for a brief period of time. And then there is the Glorious Revolution, which is basically King James basically flees to France, and William and Mary, that's what the college is named after, if you ever heard of the term William and Mary, they come in, they establish Protestantism, but they also take away totalitarianism. Certain things get passed. I think one is the Bill of Rights. Yeah, in 1689, after William and Mary come into power, Parliament basically puts them into power. They basically pass this very important thing. We have the Magna Carta as a backdrop of certain individual rights for British citizens, but the other big one is the Bill of Rights in 1689. It curtailed the power of the monarchy. The monarchy is smaller. Parliament, which is partially elected by the people, is the real power broker of this moving forward, and certain rights of citizens like jury trials and things like that are going to be preserved. One thing that's not big in British history as much as the United States is also freedom of speech. That's novel to the American history, and we'll get to it. So, but anyways, these new rights and these new principles, they eventually become, there's communication issues, obviously. We don't just call people up or text them, hey, guess what's happening over Mother England? But eventually these concepts and these new freedoms and identities over self-rule and Parliament, representative bodies being the most salient or important, really takes hold in the United States as well. We know Virginia, again, and Massachusetts are the first, and now there's new governments going to be created. We know the King of England, who was sympathetic during this period of time, establishes what we considered a part of Maryland, and Lord Baltimore, who's a Catholic, comes over, and there was a lot of immigration of Catholics who still live in Great Britain, but they felt like they were being harassed, and they were the minority, and they came over. They were trying to create sort of this beautiful multi-religious identity. It never really took hold. Catholics had control for a very short period of time, but they stayed in that area. But Puritans moved in, and many Virginians moved into the Maryland area and basically made the Protestant faith not only dominant, but officially recognized. A lot of people don't realize religions were officially recognized by the governments of the colonies at those eras, and they were part and parcel of governance. We separated from that much later, but a lot of people think that's the roots of our nation. That's not true. The roots of our nation were not separation of church and state. They are very much part and parcel of a reflection of religious values at that time. So the different royal colonies take place. We know William Penn, who's Quaker, gets Pennsylvania, and they kind of ripped off the Native Americans when they bought it. They pretended they were doing it legitimate, but I love this story where they would do a measurement, and the measurement would be based upon how far a person could walk in a day and a half or travel in a day and a half by foot. And so the government of the British colonial government said, okay, and they hired the best runners that were available, and they ran like hell, and they ended up getting something like, I think it was 12,000 square miles, basically Pennsylvania, out of the deal. And the Delaware Indians, that's what they were called, Native Americans, felt very cheated in it, and they hold on to that grudge for a long time, even though it was a written contract, or maybe not written, but it was a contractual agreement that they felt a bit like they'd been taken by. But that creates Pennsylvania. We know Roger Williams settles in Rhode Island, also with Anne Hutchinson. She's kind of very interesting issue. To me, the first women rights advocate ever, because we have a very patriarchal society at that time, meaning men dominated, and the church obviously was dominated by men. But she said, hey, I'm saved. That's the Calvinistic Puritan view. I'm saved, so I'm just as good as anybody else because God has already recognized me as a chosen one. I can do whatever the hell I want. I don't have to listen to any of you religious leaders or anything like that because I'm just as much as a leader as you. So she becomes an outcast. She moves down to Rhode Island. Rhode Island becomes a bastion of many different faiths, and actually many different ethnic groups too. Jewish people, Germans, Irish, Scots, the Dutch. Many different people come to live in Rhode Island because although Roger Williams himself is very tolerant of other religions and thinks that have to be kind of holistic and egalitarian in terms of the separation of church and state, every religion should be able to prosper. He was actually very devout in his own faith and his own view of religion, but he recognized that you had to be accommodating to other faiths in the community. So Rhode Island became one of the first bastions of religious freedom. Pennsylvania as well, because Quakers, although they wanted their government to be dominated by Quakers, they had every expectation that different faiths and ethnicities and groups would come. And the Quaker faith was also very anti-slavery. And it's interesting how sometimes the faith reflected whether or not slavery would be an accepted practice or not. We know there's a lot of rebellion during this period of time about Native Americans. We know there's the Pequot War, which is part of the Mystic Massacre that happened down in Mystic, Connecticut. Some of this is over legitimate tensions between Native Americans and colonialists over control of property. We know who ultimately wins, right? Obviously, the European colonialists do. But these kinds of conflicts remained. And why were the colonialists so successful? Because they're smarter and have better tools and weapons? No, it's because they used other Native Americans that were at war. The Mohegans and the Pequots were always in conflict. So were the Narragansett. And the colonists would often tap into those animosities to basically divide and conquer. Very rarely would you get what we call pan-Native American allegiances up until much later, and it was too late really to repel the European onslaught. Very divided peoples, the Native Americans, are not one holistic, one group. They're very much divided. We know ultimately after 1675, pretty much the New England Native Americans, they're no longer a threat because of King Philip's War. Metacom, he's ultimately killed. He's wiped out. In part through a lot of misunderstandings, but we know for a period of time, Metacom really reigned some terror in Massachusetts, wiping out some English towns as just west of where I am, Deerfield, Hadley, Brookfield, which is literally 1,000 yards up the road from where I live right now. But basically the colonists really gathered together a lot of militia and other Native American groups that didn't have allegiances to the Pequots or the Mohegans and really went after them and ended the whole thing. So between 800 and 1,000 English and at least 3,000 Indian perished during this King Philip's War. It was pretty significant, but we know at the end of the King Philip War, for the most part in New England, Native American threat was completely, I don't want to say annihilated, but became de minimis, very small after that period of time. mentions a Salem witch trial. I'm hoping the book gets very good on that later because I'm, as a lawyer, I like to talk about that history. It's fascinating. So, but it does get mentioned. It does occur in the 17th century, the 1600s. Tensions between then the Bacon's Rebellion you got to talk about. It's one of my favorite topics because I think it's a bit of a mystery. Bacon's Rebellion is down in the Chesapeake Bay area, the East Coast, along the coast, very wealthy plantations, wealthy business people. In the outback along the western ridge of basically Virginia and Maryland, there's hard scrabbled farmers and pioneers not doing so great. They don't think that the leaders in the government along the East Coast are really helping them. This real tension's coming about. Well, now there's some Native American fights. It all started over a pig, according to your book, that some Native Americans wrote some money by this farmer. Come and get it. He's saying, hey, I'm not paying you. So they take some pigs and say, well, we're going to take the pay out of this. And that creates conflict. Some Native Americans are killed. Native Americans come back and kill some English settlers. And then basically what happens, hey, the Western settlers contact basically the leaders, the wealthy, established leaders along the Eastern seaboard. And they say, hey, come back from Jamestown, we need a militia together. You guys got to take care of this Native American problem we have. And they said, nah, that's really not the way to go. We had a lot of good relations with a lot of Native Americans. You guys should not be moving out that far west. So now this creates a huge tension internally between English settlers in the western sphere of the Chesapeake area, in Virginia and Maryland, but also the eastern wealthy aristocrats that are actually running the territory. And the Native Americans got like three prongs going on. So this guy, Bacon, was a real charismatic young guy. He basically creates his own militia. He goes and starts slaughtering all kinds of Native Americans, not even the ones they actually have conflict with, neutrals and peaceful Indian groups. He's out there really making a mess of the region. And the people back in the Eastern Conference, William, I always forget his last name. He was a real character, too. He was in his 70s. Where's William? Yeah, William Berkeley. His name, kind of a pompous, very wealthy guy. He's the governor of the area. And he doesn't want anything to do with Bacon. He thinks Bacon is basically out of control, so he's going to go to war with Bacon. And Bacon and him have this famous confrontation out in the public hall right in the area, and the old man comes out, William Berkeley, shoot me now, shoot me dead, I am a servant of the people, kind of a thing. And Bacon knows if he kills him he'll be a villain, and if he knows he just walks away he'll look like a coward. So it creates this real conflict between the two. There's nothing resolved on that day, but Bacon runs amok for well over a year and basically nearly overthrows the government several times. But eventually, Bacon's rebellion falls apart because it's not really clear what their mission was. A lot of people think Bacon's rebellion epitomizes the root of our revolution. It's this rejection of government that's not responsive to the people. I think it's more complicated than that. I think this is a little bit about economics. I think this is a little bit about the poor Western pioneers in conflict with an Eastern wealthy seaboard who's not responsive to their needs. And therefore, there's this underlying tension, and arms were ultimately taken up. And the book does a nice job talking about some of it was about personal grudges and personal vendettas. Some of it was about fears of Native Americans encroaching upon these Western settlements, and some of it was about power. And there was some talk about overthrowing the yoke of Great Britain even at that time among some of these rebellious leaders. We know Bacon dies of typhus shortly thereafter. His rebel group falls apart completely. William Berkeley has the rest of the remainders executed, unfortunately, like a real kangaroo court, so he looks really bad for doing it. And later, basically, British reinforcements come over from England and take over the region, and they send William Berkeley back home to England, where he basically fades into oblivion in shame and embarrassment for not being able to keep control of the area. But there's a lot of turmoil in the colonies during that period of time. The biggest Native American uprising we have to talk about is the Pueblo Indians under, I always pronounce his name incorrectly, but his name is I don't know why I can never say his name. Pope. I always thought it was pronounced Pope earlier, but I looked it up as Pope. Pope was the leader of the Pueblo Indians, and they basically are upset with being converted to Catholicism, not by the British Empire. This is by the Spanish, and this is out in Mexico, in the Mexican region out west, southwest of the United States. And they decide that they want to go back to their old religious values, their Native American values, and their Native American culture, their Native American religion. And they throw off the yoke of the Spanish rulers, and they really wipe them out. They let some of them go, but I mean, they really conquer them. And it was, I think it took some 7 years before the 12 years. It took 12 years before the Spanish, they were exiled from southwestern United States for a period of time by the Puebloan Indians, Native Americans. They were called Indians in that era. I'm not using the term Indian in a derogatory fashion, but that's what they were labeled. They were even called that in the United States Constitution. But basically, that's probably the most successful Indian or Native American uprising that was ever witnessed on North American soil, was the Puebloan Indian uprising just a few years after Bacon's Rebellion. So it's in the 1670s. And that's really kind of the last of it until we get to some later areas when we go even further west of the Ohio River Valley. But I'm talking before the big thing that's going to come up, which is our Revolutionary War. And then we know that Charlestown's almost taken over. Delaware Indians, 7 Years' War is going to come up a little later. So the conclusion of the chapter, I think, does a nice job. I'm just trying to touch on some of the highlights. This is about the settlement. What we're going to get is really, I know, Dutch has Manhattan, the Dutch New Amsterdam. I know they're here too, but in terms of major settlement, they lose it out to the English. The English are going to dominate the eastern seaboard. The French, they're not colonizing the way the British are. They're not bringing families over and propagating children and building communities. They're here to trade, and they get a very different relationship with the Native Americans. The Spanish have a very vast geographical foothold in the southwest of the United States, including Florida, Mexico, down and even to South America, certainly Central America. But their hold is pretty tenuous. The British are going to end up ultimately dominating. And we know after the 7 Years' War, the French will be completely removed, not in terms of people, but in terms of governance and power, from the North American continent. It won't be that much longer until after that the Spanish are actually not able to keep their foothold. It's going to be all British. And when we think about the Revolutionary War, it's the British are the North American foothold, if you will. It's the British fighting the British because we identify as British in that era. Sorry the video's so long. Chapter 3 is kind of all over the place. Chapter 4 hopefully gets a little bit better. It's about society. It was softer material. I like this stuff. Hopefully you guys do. Otherwise, if you have questions, concerns, don't be afraid to shoot me an email. Thanks.